Trinity Episcopal Church. Today is Tuesday, April the 14th, and it's time for my weekly check-in and meditation. So just a couple of notes on the check-in. We'll be having virtual coffee hour on Sunday, the 26th of April at 9:30 a.m. before our 10 o'clock service. So I hope you can join us for that. So at 9:30 we'll be doing coffee hour. And then I'm starting a book group. I mentioned a book a couple of weeks ago in one of my meditations. It's, It's Margaret Wheatley, Who Do We Choose to Be? Facing Reality, Claiming Leadership, and Restoring Sanity. So we'll be reading this together. There'll be more information about times and how that's going to work in This Week at Trinity on Friday. And I'm going to limit the size of the group to 8 people. So we can have multiple groups of 8 people, but this book is pretty dense, and I think if we try to discuss it in larger groups, it'll be difficult. So we can have as many groups of 8 people as we need to, and I'll be overseeing those. So if you want to be part of the group, please email me. It's rector@trinitycovington.org, rector@trinitycovington.org. And again, the book is Who Do We Choose to Be? Facing Reality, Claiming Leadership, Restoring Sanity. It's by Margaret J. Wheatley. It is available on Amazon, both in electronic form and in physical form. So go ahead and order that. As I said, it is a dense book, so it's going to take us a while to get through it, but I'm happy to do that with you all. So those are my 2 notes about checking in. I want to go back to talking about compassion. And once again, my definition of compassion is finding God's way to make true meaning in the midst of despair or indifference and acting on that truth. Finding God's way to make true meaning in the midst of despair or indifference and acting on that truth. So last week we talked about wisdom and discernment as being part of that move toward compassion. And this week I want to talk about vulnerability and answering the unanswerable questions. So there are 2 kinds of unanswerable questions. There are wise ones and there are not very wise ones. So we want to concentrate on the wise ones. An unwise question that's unanswerable is why? Why is this going on? Why are we experiencing this coronavirus? And actually, it may seem like an unanswerable question, but it's not. It's actually a rush to certainty because it requires an explanation. And we can't sit in the vulnerability when we're rushing to explain things. So I think better unanswerable questions are, what does this mean? And we can't answer that yet about the coronavirus because we're only at the beginning of it. And any answer that we have now will be either wrong or completely impartial. Not impartial, but only partial. And the other one is, how do we make meaning of this? Because the old tools and explanations no longer seem to be working. So we have to just live with that question, as writer, I've just forgotten his name. Anyway, one of my favorite writers says, we have to live the questions now. And that's what we're doing. We're just living the questions now. And we'll live along into the answers at some distant date. So I want to talk to you about a deeper form of vulnerability, which is tied to the human condition. And we can't get there yet. We have to start not with vulnerability, but with shame. And Brené Brown, in her book Dare to Lead, says shame is that intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. So it's that experience of that feeling of being deeply flawed and not being worthy then of love, belonging, and connection. And the 2 things that she talks about are, as harbingers of shame, are never good enough and who do you think you are? And the way out then of shame, is then vulnerability. And Brené Brown, and again in her book Dare to Lead, has a whole chapter on the techniques to move from shame to vulnerability. But I want to talk more broadly and sort of theologically about it. I want to this I got from it's Kurt Thompson, The Soul of Shame, and in it he talks about a theological point about vulnerability and then tells a biblical story which connects it to God. So let's do the quote about theology first. And he says, vulnerability is not just a random state of neediness or openness to danger. It is built into the cosmic fabric of the world to provide the opportunity for discovery and creation and for the emergence of beauty and goodness. Let me read that again. Vulnerability is not just a random state of neediness or openness to danger. It is built into the cosmic fabric of the world to provide the opportunity for discovery and creation and for the emergence of beauty and goodness. I love that quote. And it really goes on to say that if you are certain, then you cannot come to beauty or creativity or goodness. We have to be open and vulnerable in order to get to those things. And Thompson goes on to tell a biblical story. It's from Genesis 3. It's the story in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve have just eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge and are kind of hiding from God. And God comes into the garden and comes to find them. So Thompson says, it is easy for this passage to draw our attention primarily to what Adam and Eve are feeling and how they are responding. But what was God feeling as he inquired, where are you? What must it have been like to have known, to have felt the rejection from humans? It is not hard to read this story and immediately conclude that the humans were rejecting God, for indeed they were. It may take more work for us to imagine that God actually felt that rejection, and though it did not keep him from continuing to seek us out, we have no reason to doubt that the moment was the first of many moments that would culminate on Good Friday. Only when we see Jesus do we begin to get a picture of what God may have been experiencing when his vulnerability was first exposed. So it's God's vulnerability being exposed, which is a completely different take on it. And he goes on to say, notice that from the beginning, when God comes, he asks questions. He is the one pursuing answers. Where are you? The question assumes vulnerability is in order. He is seeking naked creativity. He is asking us to be as vulnerable as he was in creating us in the first place. He is looking for us because he longs for us to be with him even as he is with us, for us to know his delight with us, which is present at all times, even in the presence of other things he may simultaneously feel. He is not asking the couple their whereabouts to inquire their geographical location, nor simply information about the state of their souls. His question is a means of connecting. He is not inviting them into a place of vulnerability merely for vulnerability's sake. Rather, vulnerability is the state we must pass through in order to deepen our connection with God and others, given our condition. There is no other way. I like that positive take on vulnerability that gets us away from being naked or afraid, which often we might feel when we're vulnerable, but rather that this is the way that we seek connection to God and with one another through the state of vulnerability, which then brings us collectively to the places of beauty and goodness and truth. So I think that's a great way to think about vulnerability that is far less negative than we usually think or let's say we feel about vulnerability, which then can induce fear in us when we think about being naked in front of other people in whatever way that is. So that's my meditation today on vulnerability. We'll have a couple more in the coming weeks. But again, if you want me to talk about certain things during these meditations, please do not hesitate to let me know. My email address is rector@trinitycovington.org. Again, rector@trinitycovington.org. And once again, I'll see you in church.